Welcome, everyone, once again to the Agroecology webinar series. My name is Evelyn Zuniga, and I am one of the communications officers for the Agroecology Partnership Project. The Agroecology Partnership officially started in January 2024, and it's funded under the Horizon Europe program. It currently unites the European Commission and 72 partners across 26 member states, associated countries, and third countries. The Agroecology Partnership seeks to support the agricultural sector to meet the targets and challenges for climate change, biodiversity loss, food security and sovereignty, and the environment. The partnership combines the resources from the European Commission and the participating countries to fund advanced research that generates essential knowledge and innovative technologies that closely aligns with its goals. This is the third webinar in our series Agroecology Biodiversity, and throughout this series we will explore key practices, challenges, and innovations that contribute to maintaining healthy and productive crops for resilient ecosystems. Just a housekeeping announcement, please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A and the chat section that I have activated for everyone, and I am going to do my best to address as many as possible with the time that we have today. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Adam van Bergen, who is currently Research Director at the French National Institute for Agriculture, Food and the Environment, INRAE. Dr. van Bergen's research focuses on pollinators and agricultural landscapes, examining how insect communities respond to human-driven environmental change and how farming practices influence biodiversity and food production. He has led and contributed to major European research initiatives, including projects at the Science Policy Interface, and is actively engaged in advancing evidence-based, biodiversity-friendly agricultural policies. Today, the title of his presentation is Promoting Sustainable Agriculture for Pollinators, which is the project Agri4Pol, funded under Horizon Europe. Dr. Van Bergen, thank you so much for joining us today and for giving us some insights into your project. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. I'm just gonna let you share your screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evelyn. Can you see it in slide view?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today on this subject. As has been introduced, I'm going to present the Agri4Pol project, which the title of which is Promoting Sustainable Agriculture for Pollinators. And this project started last year, at the beginning of January last year. And so we're only 1 year in. So really today I'm giving you a sense of our project's ambition and the sort of tasks we're undertaking over the next 4 years. But before I get into the project itself, I wanted to set the scene for it and explain, if you weren't already aware, the context and the drivers behind this research project. And I'm just going to present this in the form of a few key messages for you. The first is that pollinators are predominantly insects and solely insects in the European continent that ensure plant reproduction through pollination. That's to say they transfer pollen between the male and female parts of flowers. And in Europe, we have a single species of managed honeybee, but we have many thousands of species of wild bees, as well as thousands of species of hoverflies, other flies, butterflies and moths, and indeed other insects that to one extent or another carry out pollination services supporting agriculture and indeed wild plants too. And together these wild and managed pollinators provide multiple benefits in terms of ecosystem function, in terms of supporting agriculture, and in terms of creating other values for society. The second key message, which you may or may not be aware of, is that pollinators are declining in their diversity and abundance, albeit with substantial local variations. How do we know this? Well, we know this because in 2016, the IPBES published its major global synthesis, bringing together information from around the world, scientific information on the decline of these insects and the factors causing it. And I've just shown in this slide here a particular case study example coming from Great Britain, where you can see over time the decline in the presence of pollinator species in the British landscape, whether they are wild bees or hoverflies. So there is a problem. What's causing that? Well, the IPBES basically distilled it down to the fact that there are multiple causes of pollinator decline. We have the loss or degradation of habitat and the quality of the landscapes in which they exist. We have issues linked to intensive land management or the type of land management and land use changes. We have the role of synthetic chemical products, such as insecticides, but also herbicides and unexpectedly fungicides. There are issues around pollinated diseases, sometimes linked to honeybee management. There's also the increasing threat from climate change and also from invasive alien species, which are frequently transported around the world by human activities. And I've just highlighted there in blue those factors that this project Agri4Pol will be addressing. The fourth key message is that there are a whole suite of policies in the European Union that touch on or directly affect pollinators and their preservation. There are measures in terms of biodiversity strategies, in terms of specific initiatives targeting the improvement of the state of pollinators. We have in the European Union the nature directives, such as the birds and habitats directives, and most recently there's been the adoption into law of the nature restoration regulation of the European Union. And in that regulation, there's a specific article which talks about the restoration of pollinator populations in Europe. And of course, when we're talking about agriculture in the European Union, the preeminent policy that shapes agriculture is the common agricultural policy and the various incentives that provides for farmers to produce food, but also to engage in environmental promotion and benefits. There are specific regulations as well around pesticides, such as the Sustainable Use Directive. But it's true to say that after the withdrawal of a strengthening of the pesticide regulation from in 2024, this regulatory pressure is somewhat present. And the other thing to say, of course, I've already mentioned climate change. There's pollution in terms of greenhouse gases and their effects. So there are regulations dealing with the issues around climate change and around other pollutants such as nitrogen, and those can have indirect effects on pollinators. So those are the sort of setting the scene for our project, and the overall goal of Agri4Pol was therefore to try and promote the benefits of transforming agriculture from being a pressure on pollinators. Remember, I talked about land management in particular in that last slide, but one, from being a pressure on pollinators to becoming a positive force for restoring and managing pollinators and pollination services that support agriculture, of course, but also provide food and other benefits to ecosystems and people. Our project is termed a multi-actor project. This means that the idea of transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity is central to our work. And if you look at this diagram here on the right, this illustrates that for you. So we have had and are continuing to have a process of engaging with multiple stakeholders throughout the life cycle of the project. Indeed, before the project started, we started that process. And this sets the scene for the work, the scientific work that's going on inside the project. We're working on the biology of the system, on how pollinators in the landscape interact with the crops in those landscapes, but also with the other plants, the wild. There we go. Okay, back online. So we're addressing these issues, these relationships between crops and pollinators and other wild plants in the system through three work packages that look at, firstly, the different varieties, the different genotypes of flowering crop species that require pollination services, and how those genomes of different varieties are linked to the expression of different traits that affect the attraction and reward of pollinating insects. We're then moving up a scale to looking at the field to farm scale and trying to understand how the spatial temporal diversity of crops in the landscape affects the delivery of pollination services. And then we have a work package that looks more at the biodiversity of the system, the landscape structure, and the degree to which ecological infrastructures in those landscapes affect the biodiversity of the community of pollinators, but also the services they're providing to crops. So in these three bits of the project, we're working from the crop gene through to the agro-ecosystem scale. In the fifth work package, we're beginning to look at the social, economic, and political obstacles and opportunities and levers affecting the uptake of pollinator-friendly farming. And then we're concluding our project with analyses and engagement with policymakers from national to international levels and communicating our science and our findings ultimately to achieve the goal of establishing a pollinator-friendly farming system in the European context. Just a quick word about the size and the composition of the consortium. You can see in this map here, in the shaded areas, are the countries that are involved in this project. We've got 12 academic partners, research partners in 13 countries, 11 from the European Union, plus the addition of Switzerland and the UK. And on this map, you can see in the stars all the different research partners shown. We also took the step, because this is a multi-actor approach, to make sure that we had in our project policy experts and practitioner partners embedded in the project, so they received direct funding, and you can see them illustrated by their logos here and on triangles on the map. Furthermore, we established from the outset a stakeholder advisory board to provide the project with strategic advice, and we meet with them regularly throughout the project. And finally, we have specialists in project management and in communications that assist us. Indeed, beyond that, we have a very diverse landscape of external stakeholders, farmers, farming organizations, businesses, environmental NGOs, policy institutions, and so on, including other scientists. And this slide really just gives a taste of the different actors that we will be engaging with during our research and during our communication, dissemination, and exploitation of our results. This slide really just illustrates the project in a more traditional way. So as I've said, we've got this multi-actor approach in the work package 1 that is basically framing the work. In the yellow, we've got the different biological work packages. We have the socioeconomics in green, and then we have the policy and practitioner engagement in blue here, work package 6, and communication, dissemination, exploitation there. And what I'm going to do now for the rest of this talk is just run through these different work packages in turn, giving you some highlights on the sort of tasks they're each undertaking. So work package 1 is all about this multi-actor co-design of our research and trying to identify end-user options for promoting pollinator-friendly farming. And this really boils down to a co-definition of the priorities, the values, and the acceptability to farmers and agricultural organizations of potential pollinator-friendly farming practices. But also we're seeking to identify the socioeconomic and ecosystem co-benefits that can arise from the implementation of this pollinator-friendly farming, and crucially, trying to understand that from the perspective of farmers and other agricultural stakeholders. So in this work, we've been carrying out workshops and will continue to do throughout the project lifecycle, engaging and discussing with various stakeholders. And we're also carrying out in this work package, but also elsewhere in the project, various focus groups with farmers and agricultural businesses, interviews, and we're doing that in 5 countries to check for subnational, that's to say regional variation in the identified priorities and the values and acceptability of pollinator-friendly farming. And this work package also has a task to develop a catalogue of monitoring methods. And there we're thinking of synthesizing existing knowledge and any new information that comes from our project with a view to helping farmers on the one hand, but also nature conservation organizations in terms of future monitoring and perhaps compliance with this EU legislation I mentioned earlier, such as the Nature Restoration Regulation. The second work package, as I said before, is focused on the genetics of crop traits that affect the attraction of pollinators with a view to trying to develop a pipeline towards future pollinator smart crops. And what these people are doing in this work package, and in each of these slides I should have said, I illustrate the leaders of these work packages at the bottom of the slide. Well, they've been doing some work already this year on a machine learning model using artificial intelligence, which can be used to detect and discriminate images of pollinator visitation by different species or different functional groups of crop pollinators using video images captured in the field and then analyzed using the machine learning model. But the major part of this work package is about trying to stimulate this breeding of so-called pollinator smart crops by identifying in two focal species that we've identified as being important, the sunflower and the faba bean. And what they're doing here is looking at the genetic variation in these crops, using crop accessions and linking that variation to floral traits that attract and supply nutrients like nectar and pollen to pollinators. And the idea here then is to try and develop try and identify pollination syndromes that could be commercialized in the future with traits that basically elicit and improve the delivery of pollination services. And at the same time, during this work, they're looking at associations between different genes to try and identify if there are any synergies or trade-offs between the traits that are pollinator friendly, but also other desired crop breeding targets. For example, genes that help the drought tolerance of a crop or it's resistant to a pest. In work package 3, they're focused very much on the benefits of pollinator-friendly farming systems for farmers and farming. And there's a whole sequence of tasks looking at how landscape configurations affect the interplay between the crop, the pollinator community, and wild plants, and what that means for crop pollination services and yield. Also looking at how this varies in space and time to try and understand how the matching of crops with pollinator species and their traits affects pollination services and yield, and also the rewards offered to sustain pollinator populations. There's some modeling work going on, which will look at emerging crop-pollinator interactions on the different scenarios of global change. And we're doing some big experiments across different countries looking at the effects of crop diversification within and between species. So that's blending different mixtures of species in the landscape, but also looking at varieties of species and what that does in terms of affecting the service provided by pollinators. And there's a large-scale experiment that's planned in 2027 for analyzing the agronomic scale performance of pollination syndromes of sunflower and how that relates to the attraction of pollinator services, and that's been done across Europe later in the life of the project. Work package 4 is addressing these issues at the landscape scale, so looking at how ecological infrastructure put in place for pollinators and the co-benefits of that ecological infrastructure in terms of supporting wider biodiversity, for example, how that operates from field to landscape scales. So this team will be looking at the dependencies of different crops on multiple ecosystem services. So pollinators, yes, but also things like carbon cycle in the soil or dependencies on natural enemies for protection against pests. They're going to be looking at the literature to try and identify what combinations of management interventions can maximize pollinator biodiversity, but also other agrobiodiversity that's beneficial. There's going to be some experimental work in field situations looking at the dynamics of how pollinators behave between the crop resources in the farm and in the landscape and other plants in the ecosystem. So these wild plants, whether they're weeds or other species in semi-natural areas. There's a task that's going to seek to try and establish what is the optimal level of ecological infrastructure, so these semi-natural habitats that can either be maintained or restored in the landscape for these pollinator populations and their services. And they're also looking at how this might be affected by different scenarios of global change, such as different compositions of landscapes. And they're going to pinpoint strategies for upscaling the local benefits of installing, say, flower strips on your farm, which support local pollinators, what that does at the landscape level in terms of maintaining the meta community of populations and communities. Sorry. The fifth work package is really looking at the social and economic opportunities and barriers towards implementing pollinator-friendly farming. And really the two key objectives of this work package is to evaluate the willingness to act of farmers and other stakeholders based on the economic and socio-ecological values and the costs and benefits identified and associated with pollinators. So we're looking at farmer and other stakeholder knowledge and perceptions about the issues, the pollinators, the services, and the trade-offs therein, their willingness to contribute to the preservation of pollinators, and what is deemed acceptable by them of the various policy measures under the Common Agricultural Policy that can promote pollinator populations. We're also working across the whole value chain, the agri-food chain, to understand the views of different food system actors. So that might include retailers, but also consumers, and see if these attitudes change when presented with information, new information on what farmers and consumers actually want. They're going to be evaluating the perceptions of consumers and their understanding and trust in labeling or certification systems, i.e., that's to say, if there's a pollinator-friendly farming label attached to a product, does it influence their purchase intentions? And looking at their willingness to pay more for such label products. And they're looking also here at the effectiveness of different communication strategies and the role of the endorsing authority on the intention of consumers to purchase. So the endorsing authority there could be governmental or non-governmental. Towards the end of the project, we're basically going to be, well, we've started already, but we're going to be making sure that we're communicating very well and disseminating our results to policymakers and practitioners from the subnational all the way up to the international policy environment. So we're going to be doing some evaluation through things like focus groups and interviews of the subnational political contexts that affect implementations. That's engaging with end users such as farmers and agricultural organizations, but also informing global policy institutions such as the CBD of the evidence base for pollinator-friendly farming. And of course, this being a Horizon Europe funded project, we're informing actively the European Union itself and their member states in terms of the opportunities based on the evidence that we're collecting to strengthen policy instruments to promote pollinator-friendly farming practices. And ultimately, we also have a task here to produce some good practice guides, and I think we'll collaborate quite heavily with other projects working closely on this topic to develop guides for a range of landowners to highlight how to promote pollinator-friendly food systems. Our last work package is all about the communication, dissemination, exploitation, and identifying synergies with other projects. And this is led by Pensoft, but with support from INRAE. And you can find our website, it's live. You can find everything about the project there. You can download information on the project in terms of various flyers, which have been translated into different languages. And there's loads of materials that you can access. Pensoft have also set up various social media channels which you can follow the project, and they are with us actively engaged in many other projects around the European Union and seeking to explore synergies with those projects to maximize our collective funding in order to try and advance the ideas of biodiversity friendly and pollinator friendly specifically farming. So I'll conclude there. Just thank you for your attention and draw your attention to the fact that you can follow us online. As I said at the beginning, we're just starting our work. We're a year in, but we've basically been spending time working with stakeholders to shape and refine our project objectives. And we've been doing some preliminary work in terms of genetic screening of crops and things like that. But from this year, we're really ramping up the efforts and doing many, many more scientific studies. And so you can follow the news on that either online or you can subscribe to our newsletter that's issued via Pensoft. And I'm happy to stop there and take any questions there may be.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Van Bergen. Maybe I have a little bit of delay in my connection. It's kind of strange, but I hear you well. I just want to remind everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A section and in the chat section. I'm just going to address as many as I can. So while people are typing away, I'm just probably going to start with some questions of my own. eh, you mentioned that the project it's only starting now. So in these first months, like what have been the main priorities to like on setting up the project?
Yeah, so we've made a lot of efforts to engage with these different stakeholders. So, and in fact, before we received the funding, before we during the competition, we decided to already set up an early workshop in the summer of, I think it must have been 2023, where we met in Brussels with a diverse bunch of stakeholders to scope out with them our ideas and to get their direct feedback as potential end users of research. And we continued that process. We kicked off our project with a meeting in February of last year, and we invited stakeholders to that. So we carried on that conversation. And in September of 2025, we had a 2-day workshop with all these stakeholders where we really got into the details of our proposed plans in terms of research and in terms of outreach, and really actively workshopped with them to refine those and make sure they were fit for purpose, let's say, and also to take on board any new ideas they had about how to do things. So that took up a lot of time. The geneticists, though, they started essentially carrying out various preliminary trials last year. So screening the existing accessions, that's to say the collections of seeds held by different organizations, looking for varieties, which they then did some preliminary trials on in field conditions, grew them up and started to test the camera and AI model in terms of detecting the visitation of different pollinator groups to, say, different varieties of sunflower in one case. And also, they did some preliminary sampling of the nectar and pollen because they're going to be analyzing the chemistry of those things and what that means in terms of attracting different pollinator species. So yeah, lots going on already, even though it's only a year in, but science moves quite slowly, and the main trials will be happening this year in terms of the genetic screening and phenotyping of varieties, and the main ecological trials will be happening this spring, actually, where we'll be going into different landscapes around Europe and basically quantifying directly the activity of pollinators, their networks of interaction between crop and non-crop resources, and looking at the implications for crop services, doing estimates of crop pollination, for example, through visitation and seed yield and things like that.
All right.
So that's a long answer to your question. So lots going on already, but the main
Mhm.
results will be some years away.
All
Mm.
right. So during your presentation, you talked about pollinators, smart crops. Could you please kind of maybe expand a little bit on this concept?
Yeah, right. So that, I mean, that's a little bit of marketing, shall we say. What we're looking at there is the fact that in traditional crop breeding via mostly large-scale agribusiness, um, the role, if you like, of pollinators and pollination in the selection of varieties has been sort of overlooked. So the idea here is to try and identify commercial varieties, but also new varieties from seed collections, as I mentioned, trying to identify new varieties that may have some of the benefits that crop breeders and farmers are already interested in, such as drought tolerance, but also identify those varieties that have the best traits in terms of pollen and nectar quantity and quality to A, attract the pollinators to maximize their contribution to the yield of that crop, and B, offer in return the nutrition that the pollinators need to persist in agricultural landscapes. And so what we're trying to do is try and identify from these experiments and from these genetic screening, okay, these are the best varieties that also fulfill that objective of supporting pollinators and maximizing pollination services alongside the other usual targets, such as these are high yielding varieties or they're drought tolerant. So that's what we mean. Pollinator smart is really an umbrella term to um, add that goal of plant breeding, add that to the goal of plant breeding, basically. Does that sound
Yeah, yeah,
clear?
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like an added value for the crop.
Exactly. Yeah,
Um,
trying to extend these sort of traits.
mhm. And we have questions from the audience here. So it says, in work package 2, does this project carry out research on genetically modified seeds or hybrid seeds from new genomic techniques?
It doesn't. In the European Union, in fact, genetically modified crops are restricted and basically not allowed in terms of
Mhm.
commercial production. Um, Gene editing is something that's maybe on the horizon, but we don't know. But in our project, no, we're looking at essentially conventionally bred varieties and conventionally bred seed stocks. So yes, no
Okay.
genetic modification in our project.
All right. Then the next question says, which seeds are you focusing on? We're talking about this then, in your sample. And could you elaborate more on your inclusion of traditional seeds as well as seeds from one of the partners for this project, for example, Syngenta?
Okay, no. So yeah, we don't how should we say, we're targeting basically those seed stocks that are already present in the commercial market in Europe. Um, and we have a project partner in the form of Mass Seeds, who are already engaged in other European research with one of our partners, one of our labs, on another project called Helix. And so we are using some of their varieties and some of their seeds. But at the same time, research organizations also hold large accessions. INRA, my organization, has large accessions of seeds, both for sunflower, but also for faba bean. So we're using some of those non-commercial seed stocks, or at least varieties that either haven't been commercialized or historically were. We're not looking in the European context at sort of ancestral or indigenous varieties or things like that. That's not what we're doing. I'm sensing that might have been part of the question there.
Okay. We have one here. It says,
So,
yeah,
sorry.
sorry. Go ahead.
Well, just to say, well, one of the reasons for using that hybrid approach of looking at commercial varieties and also these seed stocks is that there's a long pipeline from going from seed to producing the plant to testing the plant and validating it in the field. And so, in some ways, by default, we have to use existing varieties in the marketplace because it takes so much time to use the accessions to generate new lines. So that's just to explain why we have this mixed strategy.
Okay.
And the other thing to say to this is that there's quite a surprising amount of variety in the commercial stocks in terms of their attractiveness to
Mhm.
pollinators.
Okay. We have one. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Do you have any insight into the variations at national or regional level explored in Work Package 1, and how do you plan to account when delivering these in the project conclusions?
Right. Yeah. So those focus groups and interviews that are going to be carried out at the sub-national level. To explain the process a bit more, so we started the project, as I said, with this multi-actor approach at the European scale. So there we are dealing with European policymakers, with multinational businesses, large conservation organizations that are international, and so on. And so we started the conversation around pollinator-friendly farming with them, and obviously with scientists alongside in that discussion. And the idea really is to check if the conclusions at the European Union level are valid at the local scale. So in these focus groups and interviews, we're targeting local farming organizations and individual farmers in some cases to say, this is what we've discussed at the multinational European Union level. Does it resonate with you as a viable option? We could take the example of diversification of flowering crops on the farm, going from a monocultural system to a more polycultural system. And whilst we know that would be beneficial to pollinators, there may be various obstacles, either internationally, so we look at the European level, or locally. It might be something to do with climates. It might be something to do with local priorities, local markets. So it's really about having a multi-scale check on the feasibility of implementing practices. And the key thing is as well, what we're trying to do in this set of activity in Work Package 1 is to showcase to farmers and farming organizations uh, if you're implementing practice A, crop diversification, maybe, what does that mean in terms of pollinators on the one hand, but also what other benefits does it bring to the farmer, both in terms of, say, environment, it might be helping with soil nutrient improvement in the case of legumes, um, and also in terms of economic resilience for the farmer, giving them a more diverse set of options. So to answer the question, we're doing quite a lot of interrelated work, but at the two scales, and we want to make sure at the local level, if there are any avenues we've not thought of, or if there are any things that just simply won't work in Italy or in France, for example, for different reasons.
Mhm. Okay. We have a participant asking if will there be any activities to evaluate which pollinators are most relevant or important, for example, hoverflies with solitary bees, bumblebees, honeybees, and how to strengthen their living conditions.
Hmm. Good question. Yeah, so in much of the work we're doing in work packages 3 and 4, we'll be identifying the insects we encounter to the species level, so we know what they are, which group they belong to, and so we'll be able to test the frequency with which different species visit different plants, different crop plants, and sorry, I've lost track of the original question.
Hold on, I'm just kind of
Could you repeat the
checking the
question?
earlier question. Yeah, if
Sorry.
which pollinators are more will be more important or more relevant, and how can we
Yeah,
strengthen their living
yeah.
conditions?
Right, right. Thank you for that reclarification. So we got the identity of the different insects in the community that are visiting the particular crop plants. And so through that data, we'll be able to say, okay, this species or that species is more or less dominant, or they co-occur, they maybe complement one another because they're foraging at different times of the day, or they may be in competition with one another for the same crop resources. But related to that, we're looking at this ecological infrastructure. So we'll be surveying alongside the flowering crops in the landscape. We'll be surveying the edges of fields, the semi-natural areas that are in the landscape, any infrastructure farmers have installed like wildflower strips. So we'll be able to evaluate the relative importance of these areas for the crop pollinators and also whether they are helping the crop pollination or in fact competing in some cases with the crop pollination process. So we're going to get at that complex ecosystem dynamics through our surveys and our experiments in work packages 3 and 4. Yeah,
Okay. So it is involved is in the project as well. So
yeah.
we have someone asking, can you elaborate more about the farmers who are involved in the project and what is, let's say, the average size of farm, the type of farming system, if they have mixed farming system, or they have links, what are the links with the value chain, etc.
That's a good question. So when it comes to engagement with farmers at the European level, we're dealing with farming organizations, not individual farmers per se. So farming unions, for example, or representative organizations. In terms of our studies, our specific studies, each of the partners that are engaged in different aspects of the project, when they're working in the field, they have their own networks of local farmers with which they've either worked with historically or will approach through a landscape classification based approach. So it really varies on which task we're talking about. Um, we are considering farming systems in certain tasks. So that's to say, comparing agroecology or organic farming practices with conventional methods. But we're not being prescriptive, I think, is our philosophy in the project is to try and improve the situation for pollinators and farming generally. So we're presenting our options as literally that, a menu of options that farmers can take. For example, wildflower strips is a simple thing that any farmer can implement on their farm or in their orchard, depending on their needs, and it's applicable to conventional as well as organic systems. So we're trying to tackle the biology of the system and the agronomy of it, and then relate it, allow farmers to choose whether they take up this or that in some way. So we don't have a structure where we're formally testing the performance of agroecology against conventional in our project, but we do have some sites that will be organized, if you like, on a continuum from conventional to agroecology. In France, for example, we have an agri-ecological farm where it's hyper diverse. And so that contrast is part of the data set when we compare it to conventional sites in France that are quite poor in terms of species diversity and habitat diversity.
Mm.
So it's sort of in there. It's
Hmm.
just not explicit in terms of contrasting.
Yeah, that brings to this new question where somebody's wondering, like, if there are any methods or techniques. I'm just thinking about conventional agriculture to apply to attract pollinators in the field. Although, like, farmers use pesticide to kind of get rid like of pests, and they restrict kind of somehow the movement of the pollinators. So, are there any techniques that you would explore to try to attract them?
If I understand the question correctly, the concern is attract is the concern that you might have an adverse effect of pesticides if you're attracting pollinators to the field? Is that the question?
Yes,
Not
and
sure I'm understanding.
I'm gonna read it straight
Mhm.
away. So my question is, which method and techniques you will apply to attract pollinators in field? Although nowadays farmers use pesticide to get rid from pests and at the same time they are restricting the pollinators' movement in the field.
Mm. Right, so there's quite a lot there. What we're doing is studying in either real landscapes, studying the diversity and abundance and behavior of the pollinators in those real landscapes. So either those are correlative studies, so we'll be measuring the structure of the landscape, we'll be measuring the biodiversity of the pollinators and their visitation to different plants in the landscape, and we'll be assessing the intensity of management in the landscape. There's various statistical techniques that can be used to create an indicator of how intensive a landscape or a farm is in terms of its management. That all requires collecting data from real landscapes and from real farmers. So we'll try our best to disentangle those effects in terms of statistical models, but we're not and then of course, we have these experiments where we're putting into place combinations of varieties of crops. So our focal crops are sunflower and faba bean, Vicia faba. Um, but we're also looking at other crops in some of these experiments where we plant them in a mixture. So we'll be ascertaining and finding out how the diversity of species of flowering crop in a place uh, and the diversity of varieties in a place, how that influences the rate of pollinator visitation. So we've got those two things going on in parallel. We are not in our project specifically looking at pesticide effects. And the reason for that is at the same time our project was being called for and being funded, there was a parallel call and a parallel project was funded, which is called Wild Posh, and they're looking at the in every aspect the effects of pesticides on wild pollinators in the landscape and in farming. And so we don't overlap on that subject area. We're separate. So they're
Mm.
like a sister project to us, Wild Posh. And so in terms of pesticides for us, we're just looking really at integrating them in analyses as part of how intensive a given site is managed by the
Mhm.
farmer.
All
Okay.
right. Yeah. And maybe would like to close with this question because we're out of time.
Yep.
So in your vision, like if the results from your project from Agri4Pol like are very are successful, like what would the farming landscape look in 5 to 10 years? Like what is
Right.
your vision?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, if it, yeah. So what is our positive vision for the future? I think what it would be a landscape that was more diversified in terms of crops, but also in terms of habitats, crucially. I think my personal vision, and I think most people in Agri4Pol will agree with it, is that we do need a transformation of the farming system in Europe, and we need to make sure that farmers are recognized in that. They're important actors
Mm.
and they have value. I'm not about demonizing farmers. So we want a diversified landscape that meets the needs of biodiversity preservation and improving environmental sustainability, but at the same time assisting farmers and agriculture in terms of having a livelihood from which they can benefit directly, but also that society recognizes and values their role.
Yeah, definitely. It's not just only about imposing policies on them, but just like giving them options on like
Yeah, and
economically
try.
and how viable things are going to be for them in the future. Yeah,
Yeah,
I definitely agree.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to thank you once again, Dr. Van Bergen, for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. And on our next webinar is going to be in March. I'm doing webinars every 2 months now. I will be sending the invitation to everyone, and we will have Dr. Pierre Bonnet from the French Agricultural Research for International Development, CIRAD, and he'll be giving our next talk in the Agroecology Biodiversity series, which will be on the project called Garden. It's called Safeguarding Biodiversity and Critical Ecosystem Services Across Sectors and Scales. So thank you everyone for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Van Bergen, once again, and I'll see you in a next opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Enormous pleasure to see you. Bye bye.
Bye.